8.12. Hopefully, by this point in the year, you know that the three things you can always count on with Russia, or as they're called at this point in our year, the Soviet Union, that one, Russia is huge. Two, Russia is really freezing cold. And three, it is full of tons and tons of Russians. And these three things help us understand the various events we talk about relating to Russian history. Then also a little bit of review is Napoleon and Russia. If you remember, in 1812, he has one of the largest armies ever assembled, and he decides to invade Russia. He leaves in the spring, and then the Russians end up using scorched earth tactic, where they make it difficult for him to get supplies, and this forces him to continue to press on towards Moscow to get more supplies. And so the scorched earth tactic not only makes it hard to get the supplies, but it pulls the French army deeper and deeper into Russia, and then winter sets in. So for this war, for World War II, the Eastern Front, we'll use the same terminology as we used in the First World War about fronts. The Eastern Front, or what we will talk about having to do with Russia, is the biggest military event pretty much in all of history. If we count all of the battles, all of the soldiers, all of the civilians, and even to an extent the Holocaust, which takes place really in this section of Europe, we have about 30 million people who lose their lives. That is pretty darn significant. And the two countries that this will be between are Germany and the Soviet Union. Now we have now, by this point, talked about these two dictators. They both have dictatorial, totalitarian power. They both have mustaches. They both like the color red. They both use intimidation. But other than that, these two are rivals. Politically, economically, we have opposite beliefs, and these two, Stalin and Hitler, really do hate each other. So just a little bit of review to sort of preface what we're going to get into. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact from August of 1939. It was this agreement, sort of this frenemy issue between Russia and Germany, and they agree that rather than fighting each other, they will just split Poland down the middle and avoid fighting each other. Then we have Hitler's desired Lebensraum, or living space. Now, he'd gone on his progression of aggression. He had taken much of Central Europe, but now he wants even more. He wants more of Eastern Europe and part of Russia, so he can have a place for all of these people that he sees as a nuisance, that are infecting the purity of the German race. So almost think of like a town trash dump. You don't put it in the center of town, you put it way on the outskirts to get it away from the good people of the city. So that's what Hitler's hoping to do. If he can take over Eastern Europe and part of Russia, now he'll have a place to put all of these different people groups, like the Jews or Roma people, physically disabled, mentally disabled, homosexuals, all of these people that he sees as a threat to German purity. Politically, Germany is all about nationalism, that power of fascism, where Russia is about communism. And communism is clearly stated in the Communist Manifesto that it's a worldwide phenomenon. That is its goal, to spread worldwide. So Germany feels threatened by that. And then the race issue, not just Germany and the people it dislikes within Germany, but that other people groups from other powerful countries are seen as Untermensch, or inferior people, or under people. For Russia, of course, that would mean being Slavic. The Aryans see themselves as superior to the Slavs. Even though they might still have blonde hair and blue eyes, that's just one descriptor, one piece of evidence that could prove one's Aryanness, but it is not the only one. Then we have the effects of Stalin's 5-year plans. Remember, Stalin wanted to rapidly industrialize and modernize the Soviet Union. He did this by creating new cities, building factories, building up a more modern army, so that by the early 1940s, Russia and Germany are fairly evenly matched. So this will bring us to Operation Barbarossa. It's named after this fierce Viking legend. Hitler launches this in June of 1941. And this is sort of when he is abandoning his frenemy. He's no longer going to pretend that he and Stalin can get along because Hitler wants what Hitler wants. So Hitler leaves from the German-controlled Polish territory and invades Russian-controlled Polish territory. And the first thing he does is he starts disabling the Soviet communication, so radios, phones, to make it difficult for the Russians to organize and come up with a plan to fight against Hitler. He will again use the blitzkrieg tactic, meaning tanks and planes for effective speed. Once again, Hitler has a disagreement with the leadership of the army. Now, the army says, okay, we understand you want speed, you want to target sort of like that capsule flag. Hitler wants Moscow. However, the generals say that Hitler should slow down. Continuing at such a speed would mean that it would be difficult to resupply, to keep resources for the army, and that the soldiers would get tired out. But Hitler wants what he wants. And so he says no, that they must push on to Moscow. So they're traveling across Russia at this great speed, and once again, the Russians start using scorched earth, making it more difficult to get resources, pulling the Germans further and further in. So by this point, it's fall 1941, because the calendar continues moving. And as the Soviets use the scorched earth, just like with Napoleon, it's for the same effect. And it's Russia, and the second thing we always know about Russia, it's very, very cold. And by November, it's cold, so winter sets in. And you see these panzer divisions, these tank divisions. There's tons of them, but they can't function if it's too cold to operate the tanks. When this sort of harsh winter sets in, the German troops are so close to Moscow, but so far. The Germans simply weren't prepared for winter, just like Napoleon and the French troops. You have to remember, the Soviets understand this weather, so they have the appropriate clothing. They have the appropriate weapons, because the Germans' guns would freeze and would be inoperable. So the Soviets had already thought of this and were already prepared. So Hitler will have to admit to himself he will not be able to take Moscow, and so he's going to look for another target. He's going to look to a city in the south. And that will lead us to the Battle of Stalingrad, named after, yes, of course, Joseph Stalin. So once Hitler sort of regroups after his attempt to take Moscow, his next plan is to target the city of Stalingrad, and it's for a few reasons. One, it was a strong industrial city, which means it was producing quite a bit for the Russian war effort. Second, Hitler really wants the benefit of something in the win category. He hasn't had a clear victory in battle for quite some time. The third reason, in addition to the pride of winning a battle, it would be the pride of taking over the city named after his arch-rival, Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin is not a moron. He completely realizes that this would be logical, at least from Hitler's point of view, to try and attack. So then we have the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, starting to bomb the city in preparation for an invasion. So just like we saw with the Battle of Britain and even the Blitz, trying to soften up the territory to hurt as many people, to maybe force the Russians to give up. And there are a number of people killed in that process. And you would think maybe like some Londoners sent their children away during the Blitz, that the civilians might try to leave, but Stalin did not allow it. He forced the civilians to stay in the city. So now Stalingrad has the army, which does include women, because communism is far more gender equal. And here are some female snipers in the Soviet army. But there's also regular civilians, men, women, and children who are forced to stay in the city. And the reason is, one, it's just simple manpower, and just like we saw in England with the Blitz, the civilians are going to be more likely to defend their homes than, say, a soldier from some random part of Russia. So the first part, after the Luftwaffe bombing is finished, the Germans essentially roll up to the border of the city, the Volga River, and continue bombarding the city, hoping again that the Soviets will give up. What they hadn't counted on was the size of the Soviet army. The Soviet army then encircles the German army and forces the Germans essentially into the city in an enclosed territory. And the battle will become sort of street by street, using both the Soviet army and the Soviet civilians. Hitler was so desperate to win this battle that he said he would fight to the last man and the last bullet. In short, this was a pretty gruesome battle. The Germans are completely outnumbered, both by the army plus the civilians. They've been cut off from their supply lines, and they are pretty desperate. And there's a couple of videos about the Battle of Stalingrad if you're over in Canvas. So we have this image, this photograph of piles and piles of dead bodies. It is so cold in Russia that they can't even dig into the ground to bury the soldiers. So overall, the significance, in addition to simply the Soviets win, the Germans lose, is that there is the extreme loss of life on both sides. The German army loses about 850,000 soldiers, either missing, wounded, or killed. It doesn't include prisoners of war. The Soviet army loses almost 1.2 million soldiers. Then we have about 40,000 civilians who are killed in this process. However, Stalin looks at it as, he has all of these people. He can use them as cannon fodder. He can use them as a resource to hopefully wear down the numbers of the Germans. Hitler was so distraught at losing this battle that he declares a national day of mourning. This is a complete embarrassment for him. He was counting on this victory, and it makes it that much harder to accept that loss. Now, because the Germans lose so much manpower, they lose so much time and effort in trying to win this part of the war. Once the war ends, Stalin will sort of pose this issue to the other allies, meaning Britain and America, and saying that at Stalingrad, on the Eastern Front, that Russia was so essential in disarming the Germans, in wearing them down, that it wouldn't have been possible to take back the rest of Europe or Western Europe without a weakened Germany. And Stalin wants something in return. He wants a goodie bag for having worn down the Germans so much. He will actually get that. He will get control of most of Eastern Europe as his reward for running down the Germans so much to make it possible to win back Europe. And this will lead us to the Cold War, where we have this tension between an Eastern Europe and a Western Europe, and who will control it.